So my name is Saahil Jain. I'm an engineer at U.com, and I usually go for a mocha frappuccino at Starbucks.
What's happening, everybody? I am DemitriOs, your host, and today I have the immense pleasure of being joined by my mejor amigo, David Aponte. What's up, dude?
What up? Hello, everyone. Been a while since we've been on here.
I know, it has been too long, man, and I've got quite the story for you that I wanted to tell before we jump into this incredible podcast with Saahil. And this is like a search and just like deep dive masterclass. I don't know what you want to call it, but it was incredible with search. But before we get to that, I'm going to have to say women and children, or especially children, close your ears, because I've got a funny story that I need to tell David that I haven't seen him in ages, and it's a good one. So basically, you know how there's like the MLOps community meetups that are happening in real life all over the world? I went to Amsterdam a while back, and I was attending one of them, and it's not going where you think it's going to go. I know where your mind is. You think it's going to coffee shops and weed and maybe some mushrooms in Amsterdam. It's not going there. So I have a bit of a history of sleepwalking, right? And for some reason, I don't know why, but it tends to happen when I am in hotels. I've got a really funny story that we can leave for another session of when I was a kid and I got locked out of a hotel room, basically only in my boxers, but that's for another, that's a totally different session that I can explain that more. This time, I want to tell you about what happened to me in Amsterdam. And so
let's hear it.
Beautiful hotel room. Have I set it up properly? Did I perk your interest?
You did. I'm very intrigued. I want to hear.
All right. So we're in Amsterdam. Obviously, the hotel is right on a canal. It's by Vondel Park. Beautiful hotel. A little overpriced, but we can live with it. The bathroom is gigantic. And in the middle of the night, I had to go pee. And I really, it shouldn't have been that difficult of a task because I had to just roll out of my bed, and then the bathroom was right there. And I'm with my whole family, mind you. So it's my wife and my daughter. We're all staying in the same room, and it's pitch black, and it's like 3 a.m. And I have no recollection of this, but for some reason, I just wake up, and instead of going out of the bed and just walking the 2 steps into the bathroom, I got out of the bed, walked all the way around it, and then all the way around my daughter's bed, and went to the window and wrapped myself up in the window curtain, and that's where I found myself. And I woke up, and I was like, oh, I gotta go pee. Am I in the bathroom? So I start feeling around for the light, and I hit the window, and I open the window, and that's when I'm just like, where am I? What am I even doing right now?
Bro, that's scary. Who knows where you could end up? And no recollection of that.
No, I mean, I woke up next to the window, feeling around for the window. And this is a story that I wanted to tell you because search touches so many parts of our lives. And that is really what Saahil had to say for us today, man. That was it.
Yes.
I was searching for a bathroom right there, and I couldn't find it.
If only you had U.com.
If only I could have just Googled that, or no, sorry, U'd that. We got to think about it.
That's we're going to have to change the vernacular, right? It's Google hard. That, maybe UDAT or Microsoft that or Bing that. So yes, we are, just to kind of bring it back to what this episode is about, we talked a lot about search and yes, what changes are happening in this space. There is a lot of competition from the big companies to now smaller companies such as U.com, and we got a little preview into some of the things that they're focusing on, the challenges that they're facing, and how they're thinking about addressing it. Also, what they want to do to differentiate themselves and make a name for themselves. And I think there's a lot to say for U.com and a lot of great stuff coming. And so, yeah, I'm excited to get into this.
Dude, so who is Saahil? What is Saahil Jain?
He is an engineer at U.com, has some experience at Stanford. We worked at SAIL, the Stanford AI lab. Right now is thinking a lot about product, and I think that's very much in line with where a lot of people in this space are, right? The tech is there, but now how do we make a great product out of it? And you hear that all throughout the conversation, his intuition on this stuff, Great podcast. Yeah, excited.
I love how he really did, like, he has product in his blood. He thinks about the user experience, and he thinks, how can we make search different than it is now and better than it is now? And so he talked about that, and he was able to go from this very technical level of, all right, we are thinking about, like the relevance. I love the trifecta that he said, and you really have to look at these trade-offs between, what was it? Relevance,
throughput, relevance, and latency.
Latency, dude, that was so good. I was like, damn, there's a quote right there. So thinking about the trade-offs that you really have to make when you are talking about, especially in their case where they're working a lot with large language models, what's the throughput, relevance, and latency? And he really broke down the latency issue, and what he called, this was probably for me the greatest highlight, was like the actual time, or the objective time, and the subjective time that you have to wait for something. So the real Jedi mind trick that he talked about is that if you do have to wait for something for a long time, can you give the user something to do in the interim, whether that's filling out a survey or telling them something funny, maybe a joke pops up, or something that occupies the user's attention so they don't feel like, wow, this is taking forever.
Yeah, and also we discussed a little bit about the intersection of traditional classic information retrieval and the transition to your modern day large language models or generative models, and trying to bridge the gap, because there's a lot, right? He discussed how information retrieval it works really well in certain cases, but now we have this new technology that is also really great, and also discussing the outputs and thinking about how there's some trade-offs in the type of outputs, right? Or as you refer to them, the generations. What generations you produce affects how the user will, engage with your website, stay on it, and do other things. And so there's lots of interesting things to think about outside of just, performance.
Yep. Dude, well, I'm glad that you came on here and you were able to do it like old times. I know you're a fan of you, and so it was only right to have you get on here and interview with me.
Yeah. Well, hopefully you guys enjoy this episode, and for more information, why don't you it instead of Googling it?
It sounds kind of funny when I say, like, you're a fan of you.
You're a fan of you. I am. Or yeah. I guess. You.com I'm a fan of.
Yeah, there we go. All right, let's get into it.
Welcome, everyone, to the MLOps podcast. We are very excited today. We have a very special guest from You.com. I hope I don't mispronounce your name, Saahil Jain. And we're going to be discussing some really interesting questions. What's going on with the search landscape? How is it changing? How is generative AI affecting that landscape? And let's start.
You start. Where do you want to go first? It's all you, man.
Yeah, let's do it. Well, You.com is, I feel like, some people are up to date with it, keeping up with this space. Others are like, what is that? Most people know about OpenAI's ChatGPT, but not a lot of people may know about this, this You.com and their instance of that. So let's just start with this landscape. The search landscape is changing really quickly, and there's so many advances happening, especially in the NLP space and generative AI. Let's just talk a little bit about your take on how this space is changing, and what are you guys doing to keep up with it, or compete, rather?
Yeah. First of all, thanks for having me and having us on. We really appreciate it. I think, as you mentioned, search right now is an extremely dynamic and interesting space. There's so much happening, and there's been a lot of advances in the last couple of years, like five-ish years, that have really opened up a lot of new opportunities. So I think one of the biggest changes, and there's been a couple, would be, we operated in a paradigm of kind of, classical information retrieval. So if we kind of look, and I'll just kind of describe a couple transformations that have happened in search. Initially, what we think about, and the academic discipline most aligned with search, it's kind of this topic or discipline known as information retrieval. And I'll quickly just define what that means. So when we think about what information retrieval is in search generally, it's really kind of characterized by a couple properties. One of which is it's often looking for, specific documents among kind of a large set of data. So usually you're searching across a large corpus of information. Search is usually, it's not like you're looking for across 10 documents or 15 documents. You're really looking across a much more unconstrained set of documents. And often these documents are very unstructured in nature. And then also you have query that's also kind of unstructured. So this is usually like the paradigm in which search operates. So users are typing in anything, or asking a question, and they expect to receive some type of answer or links. So classical information retrieval is, kind of primarily based on keywords. The idea here being that, you look up a query and then you get kind of, keywords. And then, if you look at kind of historical search engines, you'll get blue links, essentially. You'll get like a sea of 10 blue links. And then you click on them and, some of those links have pages that have matches on those keywords. And then we kind of started moving more towards neural information retrieval. So we started kind of taking advantage of all the advances in NLP, embeddings, for example, BERT that came out, which was, I think around 2017-ish. But so then we started, being able to embed documents very well and start using, techniques like semantic search to better understand and match the meaning of a query to the meaning of a document. So that was, I think, kind of the second change and shift that happened. And this kind of had multiple implications on search, one of which was in, the retrieval stage, but also on the re-ranking stage. And then I think now what we're seeing is even the next stage, which is kind of what I would think about more as, giving you the direct answer. So when you search for something, you don't only just want links, but you often want the exact answer surfaced to you. And I think ChatGPT, which is probably the most notable consumer application that started doing this in a very new way, has really kind of struck a chord with people. And I think at U.com, we've also been thinking very deeply about this. And that's kind of what UChat and U.com is about is, with the conversational AI, we can actually very quickly surface the answer for you and try to provide citations and kind of keep improving in that realm.
It's such a better experience.
Yeah, and I think just to kind of piggyback off the last thing where now we're getting direct answers, I think that's also really exciting for people because I feel like they can just ask anything and get any answer. Help me with this, help me with that. Historically, you had to kind of figure out how to write that, right? You had to really do some engineering to what question you would put into Google search to make sure that you would get the right thing. And even then, there's still ways to mess up and get things that are not exactly what you're looking for. So to be able to express exactly what you want and get some sort of answer like you're talking to a person, I think that is very different from the way that we've typically interacted with these traditional like information retrieval systems, right? Where you have to kind of, they're very specific to the type of information that they store.
Yeah, exactly.
And I just feel like it's such a better experience that you don't have to go through different links and be spammed with so many ads if you're just trying to get some kind of recipe on how to make a vegan black bean burrito, right? And you don't have to be hit with a million pop-ups on how to subscribe or please subscribe to my newsletter or this and that. And it just makes things a lot nicer. So I see the user experience going that way for a lot of things. I still feel like there is more of, like, it's not all going to be like that, right? And I don't know about you, maybe you feel differently, but I still feel like there are plenty of use cases that you're not going to just want an answer. You're going to want to explore and get a bunch of different viewpoints on something before you make your decision.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I totally agree with you. I think that the key is to really think about how to combine the two. So when we think about generative AI and advances and the ability to provide kind of quick answers to queries or chats, we also have to think about trustworthiness, making sure that people can, ground the information, do their own research. Kind of the way we've been thinking about it is we recently, actually yesterday, had an announcement about U.com 2.0. And in U.com 2.0, we've essentially introduced the idea of kind of CAL, which is chat, apps, and links. So when you do a chat, you'll basically, get a chat response, which will be, fluid, will somewhat, use a lot of these advances and have citations as well. You'll be able to access the links as well, and you'll also be able to access U.com apps, which are essentially, you could think of them as specific information retrieval search constructions over, particular domains. So for example, let's take a programming query. If you look up something like revert a git commit, you'll be able to see kind of, a generation, and there might be some citations in that generation, but, in general, that generation will be kind of similar to what you might expect from some of these other LLMs. You'll also be able to see links. So if you want to kind of go in, read more, you can do that. And you'll also see a Stack Overflow app, which will allow you to kind of open a side panel, quickly dig into a bunch of different content. So that's kind of the way we're going about it. So I think it's very similar to kind of what you said, is that, we want to be able to make sure that people are able to ground themselves and, get the best out of the tools that they use.
I think that's a great idea because it gives you like something, maybe a direct answer you can click on, places you can go to look for further information to learn. I think that is a really good point, that the interface matters, right? Like, and I'm curious, right now, most people think of just like that one little, a tab where you start typing your search. How do you think about differentiating what to give to users? Because I'm sure there's lots of ways to figure out exactly what they want. Do they want a direct answer? Do they want a lot of information? How do you think about the trade-offs there? Giving them too much or giving them, I guess, just enough, which is very similar to what you're talking about with, I guess, U.com 2.0.
Yeah, that's a great question. That's something we're actually, grappling with right now is, how much information do we want to give the user without overwhelming them? I think historically we've always kind of been threading the line between, giving too much information and kind of sometimes giving too little. So it's something I think we're still learning, and we definitely, at least I don't have the answer for that. But I think
fair enough.
But I think in general, like the key is to kind of be a bit nuanced and basically understand when it makes sense to give them more information and when it makes sense not to. I think for certain queries, like for example, when was Obama born? In that case, the person is probably looking for a year and maybe a citation.
Yeah.
They don't need an entire, story about Obama's life. But in some cases, if you're looking who is Barack Obama, you probably want more sources that you can kind of dig into and, richer set of information. So I think it all depends a little bit on the user intent behind the query. And that's something that, is important to think about. So with search, there's just so many different types of use cases when it comes to search that it's almost hard to bucket, answers for one domain and one intent essentially when there's so many intents being served. Another really interesting thing that's happening now that I think we'll start seeing more search engines do is like we think about search and our search engine as a do engine. The idea being that you're not only using it to retrieve information but to do and take action. And I think what we'll see is that a lot of search engines start moving in this direction as well. And the idea, I'll give you an example, is you can type in something like, generate an image, and you'll get served an app that, you can use existing, image generation tools.
Nice.
You can generate an image for yourself. So historically, that hasn't really been the role of search engines. But now that we're seeing all these advances in generative AI, we're going to see, search engines kind of open up and allow you to really do things that you wouldn't have been able to do before, which I think is very exciting.
So yeah, it's just going to that next step so you don't have to click through something and you can just get what you want done in less clicks and less steps. And that makes complete sense to me. I like that. Again, it goes back to that user experience. Like if I want to do something, I want to do that thing as fast as possible because, some kind of notification might come up and get me distracted. And then all of a sudden I forget what I was doing in the first place. And I try not to let that happen, but it gets the best of me sometimes. But so when you're talking about that, I mean, there's some really key challenges when it comes to search, and you mapped out a few of those. What are some other ones that you are constantly thinking about?
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of different challenges when it comes to search. And I think I can kind of go through some different challenges. And this is going to apply to, anybody building a search engine. And I think a lot of problems can be reframed as search problems. So hopefully it's useful to people who are not even working on search, but are working on other, at other companies where, they're working on search-like problems. I think one, challenge is relevance. So in general, you want to be able to provide relevant information for your user, but relevance is often subjective. What that means is that when you're training machine learning systems, you need, ways of being able to annotate data, make sure that it's aligned with human feedback, essentially. So the idea of relevance is kind of one that's important, and I think is very tied to evaluation. So having very strong sets of evaluation infrastructure is really important to be able to kind of ensure that you can provide, highly relevant content, as well as understanding user feedback and being able to keep iterating on that. I think a second challenge in general is latency. So especially with a lot of these large language models, they can be quite slow, and we need to think of ways in order to, reduce latency, but also make the experience such that, higher latency doesn't feel slower. This could be, providing surveys of content while other content is loading. And we're kind of thinking a lot about how to make the user experience such that even if certain responses are high latency, just because we're using, very powerful models in the background, the user still is able to benefit and not really feel the negative impact of that latency. So there's different creative ways around it. I think the third challenge is really about, there's challenges around throughput and cost. So thinking a lot about how to optimize along those dimensions. User interface challenges. So, what is the best user interface? That's something we're thinking about. We've now kind of, moved more towards conversational AI and a conversational interface. And I think that's something that we've seen to have resonated with users. But yeah, I can keep going on. So maybe I'll just
let's start with that first one, talking about like relevance and how subjective it is. Something that came to mind was lots of ML problems can be framed as a search or like a ranking problem of sorts, right?
Yeah.
And there are relevance depends on the domain. I was thinking when I was working at Benevolent AI, where we thought about biological relevance, that what we were searching for had some meaning to a drug discoverer. How do you balance that? Because there's so many ways to consider relevance to a user. Is it collecting additional telemetry of like them actually engaging with the application? Like maybe that's a bit too deep into it, but it seems like relevance is a really tough thing to address. What is U.com doing to take care of that?
Yeah, and that's a good question. It's constantly evolving, the way we think about relevance. But in general, so I think you're right. So I think you mentioned one thing is about telemetry. So we are also a private search engine. So in our private mode, we actually don't use any of this information for machine learning. We do have a personal mode though, where you can have user preferences, and we do allow people to provide feedback. So for example, you can thumbs up and thumbs down on a generation, or a chat response rather, as well as apps that we provide. So we have all this feedback that's coming from users that users are volunteering and giving us, as well as personal preferences. So some users like certain sources more than others, and we try to allow them to have their preferences reflected in their search results. So relevance can also differ based on the individual. But in general, I think it goes down into kind of two categories, one of which I would think about as I guess preference-driven feedback. So preference-driven relevance. This is basically when users have preferences, how well are we able to adapt to their preferences and do it properly. So obviously, filter bubbles, etc., are also issues. So we want to be mindful of that as well. That's one bucket. The second bucket would be, thinking about what I would call offline relevance. So can we construct strong, test sets and evaluation sets in order to benchmark our systems? One example of this is we actually partnered with a company called Surge AI. And over there, we ran a study in which we compared UCode, which is our search engine for developers, to Google. And we were able to find that on a lot of queries, we're able to outperform Google along different dimensions. And we had users basically, rate which response they found as more satisfactory, which one helped them save time. And we found out we're able to save time with our apps and the way we structure our content and our relevance, essentially. So that's kind of one idea, is like offline data sets, running studies, feedback, etc. Also, the idea of weekly supervised learning is important here. Can we cheaply and, generate heuristics for labels and then use those to benchmark systems? That's also a whole nother topic. And then I think the third one would be online feedbacks, just things like, click signals, etc. Again, we're very focused on, privacy. So we do this in a way that, best aligns with that. But, understanding and responding to the way users are using our product is also important. So I think those are just a couple ways in which we think about relevance. And a lot of it comes down to the data. So I think that's something that, when we talk about machine learning systems, you can't not talk about the underlying data. So we focus very much on that.
So true. Dude, there's one thing that I always think about, and you tend to see search and recommender systems, and especially when it comes to MLOps, they're paired together, or they are like brother and sister type thing, because of a lot of these things that you're saying. Like, you can do search and it's not that far of a stretch to call it a recommender system. And so what I am thinking about when you are talking about this, because you're using large language models very much for search and recommending things to people, a lot of recommender systems are powered by feature stores when it is like what I would consider the traditional way of doing it. But you're doing it, it's like a whole new paradigm of trying to do it. How do you look at those two, and how do you like reconcile the way that you're doing it with large language models compared to this way of doing it with a feature store and trying to just serve up, like if you read any Netflix blog in the last 5 years, how they talk about it?
Yeah. So if I understand your question correctly, you're talking about, there's traditional recommender systems, which, you kind of generate features. Some of these features may be, composite features of a bunch of different ranking factors. And then some of them may be, just very simple stuff based on user data. And then you train models mapping these features to a certain action. versus now with the large language models, where you provide prompts and you get output. Is that kind of your question? Trying to understand
exactly.
Models?
I couldn't have said it better myself. I'm glad. Next time, I don't even need to come. You just interview yourself, and then we'll be all good.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think there is a place for both. So I think I don't think it's an either or. I think in some ways there's different use cases for both. So for example, for recommender systems, it maybe, I mean, we'll get to a state where a lot of these models are going to be able to do that as well. But oftentimes you don't necessarily need or want some of the randomness associated with a large language model when a very simple model will have very high fidelity. So I think that's one thing to think about is the use case. So there is definitely a role for both of those systems, in my opinion, far into the future, especially depending on the task and kind of the guarantees you need. So for example, in a case like healthcare, I think we're much more unlikely to see, large language models governing health interactions compared to more of the traditional systems, at least for the next 2 to 5 years, I would say. So that's one thing to think about is there's a place for both depending on the use case. And then I think the other aspect is, you're right, it is a very different philosophy when it comes to both, but I think both share kind of some of the same principles. And I think the same principle is around the evaluation. So in both cases, you still need to be able to evaluate the model's output. So I think once you do that, then it becomes a question of experimenting, and the methods are different in both cases, but the overall way in which you evaluate them should still be very standardized and similar. So in some cases, it is different, but there are a lot of similarities that we can carry over from MLOps practices in the past, especially related to evaluation, metrics, benchmarking, those types of things. There's a lot of carryover.
Yeah, and sometimes even combine them too, right? Like I've seen in system designs where there's like a funnel of sorts, right? Where you use a larger model, more powerful, to provide you more accurate results, and then something smaller on top of that to maybe, reduce it to like the top 10 or something like that, or vice versa. So it seems like you have to have a pretty involved infrastructure to support all of this to address these needs. You mentioned a couple of the challenges with latency, right? Because at inference time, traditionally, many of these large language models are serial, right? You cannot, they're generating tokens one at a time, or one character, and so there's a lot of research trying to find more efficient ways to do that. Let's talk a little bit about that. If whatever you can discuss, what is U.com doing to address some of these latency issues?
Yeah, so latency is something we're very focused on, and it's a fascinating subject. And I think, as I mentioned, latency is actually there's different components when it comes to latency. Part of it is there's often, I think, I kind of joke in some ways. I don't know if this is actually the name of a real metric, but I think about sometimes the actual latency, which is time to user to all the content they see, and then perceived latency, which is what does the user feel the latency to be.
Yeah,
and
that's
in some
so
ways
true.
You can definitely. Yeah, when it comes to search, there's definitely, sometimes differences between the two, which are very fascinating. But I think when it comes to, actual latency, which I think I'll just group in the former bucket, there's definitely a lot of, things that, we're working on. Part of it is, and I think, so I've actually given a talk, if folks are interested, with one of my coworkers, Sam, and we've talked a little bit about how we think about indexing. And, we've talked a little bit about some of the steps we've done there, using Spark, et cetera, to efficiently batch and embed things for semantic search. By things, I mean documents for semantic search. That's more on the indexing side, not the inference side, but there is latency in that respect too. And then on the search side, part of it is having, good infrastructure, being able to, make sure that you're, using the right amount of resources in a way that's cost efficient. I don't think there's any silver bullets though. I don't really have any.
Yeah. Exactly. And usually it's a combination, right? Like compression, some people do network pruning, there's all knowledge distillation, like there's all sorts of tricks that people are using. And it seems like most companies using a mixture of the two.
Yeah, that's important too, like using smaller models.
The best Jedi mind trick in my eyes is what you were talking about when it comes to having somebody fill out a survey or do something while they're waiting, because then the perceived latency goes out the window, right? It can be as long as it needs to be, but if I'm preoccupied while I'm waiting, then I don't even recognize that I'm actually waiting.
Yeah.
And then, sorry, the only other thing I wanted to talk about related to some of the challenges is with throughput, right? I think this is related to something we discussed earlier, where how much you want to give the user so you don't overwhelm them. Are there any, I guess, noteworthy challenges between the trade-off in latency and throughput at inference time with your models? Anything worth mentioning? I know that's been a challenge, especially with generative models, generating images or generating some sort of text. I know there can be some challenges there trying to find the right balance between the two. Is that relevant at all for how you present results?
Yeah, in general, I think there's probably a trade-off. And when I say throughput, I think what you're talking about is also an interesting concept. And that's more about, how much information you provide to the user. When I say throughput, I also think a little bit about, how many requests are we getting per second from users. And in general, I think there is an interesting trade-off between latency, throughput, and relevance. So in some ways, these are, kind of 3 points on a triangle where you could end up having very low latency. Then you end up having, lower lower relevance because you're probably using a distilled model or a smaller model.
Exactly. Yeah.
And then oftentimes maybe that gives you higher throughput because, again, you're not using as much CPU or you don't need a GPU. So there's always this trade-off between these three different, angles. I think the relevance latency trade-off is really interesting. And I think, there's definitely a lot of ways in which you can get very high relevance. So for example, you can use, and if you were working, at a company that is, let's just give an example of, you're working at a finance company and you're trying to understand and classify documents into different classes. Like, I don't know, you give somebody a loan, you don't give somebody a loan. And say that in this case you have, a ton, and just making this example up, you have a ton of, throughput in this case. So you need an efficient solution. You can often, use a very simple model like a classifier. A very simple, BERT-based or distilled BERT-based model. And in that case, you may get low latency, but the relevance may not be as good compared to using, say, an OpenAI API where you're essentially using GPT, 3.5, where, you'll probably get better results with the prompt, but you'll end up being slower. So I think that is also often use case. I think sometimes throughput is usually not. I wouldn't recommend people worry too much about that. That's more a function of success in some ways. Like, once you have success, you'd worry about that. But really, I think the trade-off is usually a more relevant one for people.
Yeah, and you were getting into the resources that are required to do this, right? So obviously lots of GPUs are required to train these models. Let's talk about some of the challenges that Udacom is facing there with compute, because there are, again, more trade-offs there too. You can use a smaller instance, maybe using pure CPUs. There's challenges there, right? Because you use GPUs, but they're very expensive. How is U.com addressing some of these challenges or thinking through how to prioritize them for themselves?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I can't go into too much details around the way in which you do, but I can give a high level, a little bit about how we think about some of these issues.
Yep.
So I think you're right. I think it comes down ultimately to the user experience. So what can we do to, really trace back from there? I think one thing that we have noticed is that GPUs are quite expensive. So in general, when we can use CPUs, we do. So I think CPU, is important. I think, one thing to think about with CPU usage is often like CPU utilization. So a lot of times you need to make sure that you're most efficiently using the CPU. So
exactly, yeah.
That will happen. Like, for example, if you're not careful and you don't account for, user queries that are really long, you might end up spiking, CPU utilization on those really long queries because your model ends up not batching it correctly or iterating through all of it and, doing a ton of operations. So I think those are kind of the more tactical areas we think about. But I think at a high level, I would say, GPUs are great and they make a lot of sense. And they, you can parallelize and do things a lot faster and run heavier models. But then you have to take into account costs and also the limited amount of GPUs.
There's still a place for CPUs, right? And I know that a lot of companies are investing in writing their own kernels that can utilize or better utilize CPUs because of how expensive GPUs are right now. And so there's how can we reuse what we do or we already have a lot of access to, but we have to do a lot of custom kernel writing just to make it, like you said, dealing with different sequence lengths. There's all sorts of challenges there that I think are really interesting. Just shifting gears a bit, we're talking about some of the technical details, but let's talk about U.com and what it's like working as an engineer at a small startup that's taking on big companies. It's a very competitive space. I mean, there's all sorts of news about this. People that don't even care about tech are wondering what's going on in this space. So just what's it like being in the midst of a lot of hype but a lot of it's real too. A lot of it's really, actionable. People are using it. So I feel like it must be exciting.
Yeah, I would definitely say it's very exciting, I think, to work at a small startup, or I guess a startup in general. And I think, one thing to think about is I think we definitely, are trying to really build something that will stand the test of time. And it's hopefully not, a flash in the pan. So I think that's one thing to think about a lot is, how do we make sure that our fundamentals are good? And at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter what the hype is. What really matters is, whether or not we can be useful for users, and then they'll keep coming back to us, and, they can find value. And, it's differentiated value compared to other products. I think that's really the thing that we're going after. I think, we've focused a lot on developers in the past, and we found that with UCode, where we're able to allow people to save time by, searching and then taking advantage of, code completion, as well as, Stack Overflow apps, et cetera, that allow you to access content quickly. It's a very simple use case, but that's something that has really resonated with folks. And I think we're kind of looking to do the same for more of a mass market with UChat. So really thinking about how to, fulfill user, requests and really provide differentiated value for them. I think that's the joy of working at a startup and then iterating as well.
There, you mentioned some of the differentiators. Like one big one is citations. In fact, that's like one. My wife's a lawyer, and one of the biggest, I guess, like critiques of some of these language models is that they sometimes provide wrong answers or no references to where they got these answers from. And for certain industries, that's critical. You need to be able to cite a source, reference a source, dig deeper into that. And I use U.com because of that, the fact that it provides references. So what are some other things that you think make U.com different from your traditional search engine besides the obvious like technology behind it?
Yeah, definitely. So I think there's definitely there's a couple of factors. And if we think about U.com in general and then UChat, I'll maybe go into both of them. And I'll start with UChat. So UChat is our conversational interface. And this is really where we're seeing a lot of excitement. We also see excitement in U.com in general, so both of them. But when it comes to UChat, I think you're right. So one of them is the idea of being able to cite content. So when we show you a generation or we show you, a chat response, we try to cite the content. And we also are now including, web results as well as what we call our U.com apps, which have specific information from highly curated sources. So this is all part of the idea of being able to be more trustworthy. And we still have a long way to go. So we do have a disclaimer right now, which is we're still working and making sure that, the accuracy is, always improving. So users should be aware and, know how to best use the tool. But in general, I think being able to have a really trustworthy chatbot is something that we're hoping will be a differentiator. And we have a lot of research and a lot of work to do to keep improving on all these fronts. But that's maybe one reason. And the second one is, and I think I hinted at this on the first one, but accessing a chatbot in the context of a search engine. It's a little bit different than accessing a chatbot in another environment. So the advantage here is that you can then quickly toggle and switch modes. Because a lot of times you're chatting and then you want to be able to dive deep. So we're trying to be able to enable both of those modes of exploration. So having a chatbot in the context of a search engine is something that we think is unique and can provide value. And I think the last one is accessibility and user interface. So we're trying to focus a lot on having a really nice user interface, figuring out the best way to not overload users with information, provide them, tools to dig in deeply. So those are kind of maybe three axes of differentiation. And the last one would be this concept of an open platform. So the idea is that we have other people who can build apps which will eventually, which do live in U.com. And we've had a couple of partners. So one example is a company called Luria. So they're a shopping company. They have like reviews and sites, whatever, and that type of stuff. And they have an app on U.com. And the idea is that we'll have all these, external folks essentially, building apps on U.com, and we'll be able to surface their content, hopefully allow them to monetize as well, and kind of grow the pie and really allow them to plug in whatever they build into a rich conversational interface. So I think that's maybe a little bit more about the future, is kind of building out an open platform where it's not just us, but it's really an open community that's building, a new product together.
How do you see people, like, if somebody's listening to this and they want to go and start playing around, or they want to think about different use cases, like, how do you see people using this? What are some cool use cases that you've either seen or you've thought about and you just haven't had the time to build yourself?
Oh yeah, so you basically use cases to build just in general for search.
Yeah. Oh no, on top, like in this app open ecosystem that you're talking about.
Yeah. I think there's so much room. there's so much unsolved territory in search. It really could be anything. I mean, you could think of, if you have a really cool generative AI app and there's some queries that you think that it should be listed for, we can kind of take that into account, and we can build whatever we can incorporate whatever you build into search results and present it to, our users. So that, and that's kind of, you can think of it as an access point that you have. So there's the App Store on Apple, which is one access point to users. Hopefully U.com will be another access point, which will allow you to kind of richly integrate whatever you're building and show it to users. So I would say things like that, really simple things like a really good calculator app would be a great one to add. That's something that has been our backlog for a while. So it could be as complicated or as simple. There's a space for a lot of different things right now.
And let's talk about, I guess, what would be interesting to developers, data scientists, practitioners that are looking to integrate U.com or a way to leverage U.com into their day-to-day projects. So I'm thinking about AI tools for engineering. Can we talk about some of the ideas that U.com has for that?
Yeah. I think right now is another shift that's happening in engineering is, there's a lot of tools that can make engineers a lot more productive. So historically, there's always been tools that we've used. I think one of the best ones in my opinion has been Git and, collaboration tools for engineers. Just imagine, collaborating without really good version control software. So I think what we're seeing now is going to be maybe as important as that for engineering. So maybe in the future, we'll look back and the idea of, writing code without having access to code completion modules and, AI will be as, foreign as the concept of working at a company without version control, which is maybe a bold statement, but it seems like, we are headed in that direction. So I think one way is, with UChat, you can type in developer queries and you can get, rich output, and, you can test whether or not it compiles. I think the great thing about the code use case that I'm particularly excited about is that it is very procedural. So you can quickly verify yourself a lot of times whether or not it works. Obviously you'll have to customize it to your context. I wouldn't expect, especially at certain companies, you can just plug it in, it'll work out of the box, but it can save you, 50% of the time, tracing down what library to import, certain syntax. And if it works, then great, you have a starting position to build on top of. That's one of the advantages of some of these procedural types of queries is users can kind of immediately get used from them and they don't have to be perfect.
Yeah, I hope it's okay to ask, but one thing I was immediately thinking about was, OpenAI and the way that they're thinking about training these models is with a mixture of text and code, because apparently there's some interesting relationship between if it learns from code, it learns maybe logical relationships, it learns how to think procedurally, right? But language is more open and sloppy, but you need both to give good answers, right? And I don't know if there's other things to include on that that could also, make it a bit. It seems like it depends on what, like for each one of the endpoints that U.com has, you may have different models, right, that prioritize different types of responses. Is that okay to ask about the nuances, or is the idea that you'll have one model that serves all of them? I imagine that's not the case.
It would be a mixture. So careful. You're being so careful, David. I love it.
We want to be mindful, for things that are proprietary. So whatever you can disclose at a high level. Again, it's just thinking about some of the interesting challenges that they face there, like what data to collect to actually provide output that, like you mentioned, is relevant to users. Because again, we're providing a specific type of output depending on your output for code, for writing, for whatever the endpoints are.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And it's something to think about a lot. And one thing I remember is, when we were running a lot of these search studies in which we compared UCode to Google, a lot of the feedback was, we would sometimes show code snippets without context. We would just kind of throw out, here's the answer in code. This is the code snippet you should use. And even if it was correct, it would be a little bit startling to users because, we do expect there to be some text content. So that's something we've adapted towards. So you don't just want code, you do want text with code, unless you're, I mean, there's very few cases, I think, where you would just want a hanging code snippet, and that would be useful to you. You'd want some type of explanation of what this does. So I think that is very important. So I think, there are ways of seamlessly generating it or including code snippets with basically with text that we've done. So we do this right now. So if you do search certain queries in UChat, you should have both code snippets with proper formatting and like syntax highlighting, etc., incorporated into the response. And then we also separately have, corpuses of information, these apps that we have, in which we've, indexed a lot of these code snippets along with the text associated with them. And in that case, we can definitely,
Got it.
and we're not only searching against code snippets, but also against the text. Because a lot of time, if you're searching for something, you're often using natural language. Often,
Exactly.
you're debugging, you might be, typing in code. But I would say there's probably like a 70-30 split where most of the time you're searching in language. And then sometimes you're debugging. And a lot of times debugging is stack traces. It's not even really code snippets. So the chance that you're actually typing in a code snippet, maybe if you're looking for documentation, then it's fine. But in general, you are, trying to understand and use natural language. That's the way we interact in order to find text and code snippets. You're not really typing in code snippets looking for an exact match on a code snippet with another code snippet. So yeah, we do think a lot about this, and there's which we try to incorporate the different elements.
And it seems like that will also shape the interface in some ways, right? Like how the outputs will also be related to the type of interface that a user will, interact with. You mentioned about these different apps that are going to be provided, having kind of a variety of outputs, like some with references, some text, and then some things that they can click on. So it seems like there are lots of trade-offs to consider here.
Yeah, definitely.
Dude, so then do you see a world, and forgive me if this is like what you're actively trying to do, because I may be a little slow, but is it where you're going to be interfacing also with the bugs that are created or the logs, and you can just ask questions, and then ideally the logs can go through some kind of model or something where it's much more intuitive, where you can just ask the computer, why is my shit not working? And then it will tell you in a much more natural language.
So if I'm trying to follow, are you saying that the user will provide logs to the service and then try to query and understand what's happening?
I'm just thinking about, like, if there's some apps that are built on top, and it is, I guess I don't know exactly how it would look, but for the end user, if I'm putting something together and I have my app or I'm just coding, and for some reason what I'm trying to do is not working, and then I cannot debug it by looking at the logs. I can't figure out, why is this not working? And then I could just use natural language and ask, why is this not working? And it will give me a more relevant answer as to why.
Sort of like a plugin in like editors sort of thing. I guess like Copilot would be one, but I don't know if they look through logs. But anyways, like something that would be integrated into your coding environment to help you, like you can query it in natural language. What's wrong? Yeah. Why is this not working? That would be great.
I totally agree with you. That would be great. We have thought a little bit about this. So we do have a VS Code extension where you can basically highlight a piece of code and then you right click and then you can search it on u.com. So it removes the step. We haven't yet plugged, and we do have other extensions coming out in which you'll be able to see code snippets and essentially do search within the editor. But I do think there's a lot of work to be done there. I think you're right that a lot of times the access point for developers is the editor. So we're thinking a little bit about that as well. But right now, we're focused on UChat as well. But there definitely is a synergy between the two. So, right now you can still show richer information outside an editor. You're a little bit limited, by the types of information in the UI that you can show within something like VS Code. And, if it's very easy to move from VS Code to a search engine, it makes sense. But I think for certain things, there's things that make sense to kind of show tips, Copilot, et cetera, within an editor. And I think that provides a lot of value as well. But yeah, the logs are an interesting statement. I think there's a lot of work to be done there.
Yeah.
That would make life easier.
Yeah, sure. It feels like there's so many different directions you guys could go in because of the needs, right? Like a search engine, people use it to search anything, right? And it seems like this could spin out into lots of things. How are you guys staying focused? There's a lot of excitement in this. Sorry,
the apps are for? Like, isn't that why you allow people to do everything that you are not actively doing? Because it's
that's a good point.
Build an app store so that we're not going to be able to tackle 99% of the problems. We're just going to tackle the most important to us and then let everyone else do it in more of a decentralized way and grow the pie in a way.
Yeah, I mean, you've answered it perfectly.
Yeah, that's smart.
That's it. Dude, so before we finish, I really want to know what has been something that you've been thinking about a lot lately. And take it how you want. It doesn't necessarily need to be technical, but it can be design-wise. It seems like you like design and you have a lot of product sense inside your blood. But when it comes to search or you.com, what are some things that have just been, they haven't been able to leave you alone? Like you think about them when you're going to sleep and when you wake up.
Yeah, I think there's probably a lot, but I think maybe one of them would be around thinking a lot about how to combine a lot of the advances we're seeing in NLP with a lot of the traditional, foundational knowledge and information retrieval. So thinking a little bit like, what is the place of a lot of these techniques that have kind of stood the test of time when it comes to, searching. There's, just to give a simple example, like TF-IDF, PM25, these types of techniques that have, worked kind of well historically, as well as semantic search, which is kind of, based on, embedding documents and then doing nearest neighbor search, like approximate nearest neighbor search. So there's this whole entire world of, information retrieval, traditional information retrieval, neural information retrieval, neural re-ranking, using document signals, user preferences, all this type of stuff in this world related to, large language models, and especially of the generative variety. So it's like, how do we use both of these things together? How do we kind of, use a lot of the fluency of generative AI and a lot of these large language models, which can generate really fluid text, but how do we also make sure they're grounded using, information we know to be true about the world? Because in some ways, it doesn't make sense to, have a large language model have to encode all of this knowledge about the world. There's so much knowledge about the world. A lot of it's changing, especially when it comes to live information. So in some ways, it's clear that, you will also need knowledge bases, and you need some way to combine the two in the most optimal pattern. So I think that's something that I think is probably really interesting, and there's a lot that we're doing to think there. What is the role
so good
of both, and how do they work together?
And there's been some really interesting papers actually in this space. I've been reading a few where retrieval augmented models, where they, in addition to having some output from the model, also have some corpora of information that they can also access. And to me, that was like, I thought that's what people have been doing for a long time, but apparently combining them is a bit different than using two systems side by side. But very exciting times, lots of things going on. Any closing thoughts, anything you'd like to share with our listeners about you.com, about the space, about anything that you're interested in?
Yeah, I guess the main thing would just be, I would just, if you're interested, definitely keep an eye out on search right now. I think right now we're seeing search, in a more dynamic state than it's probably been in many previous years. So even right now, I think today and tomorrow, Google and Microsoft are both coming out with announcements in which they're releasing their own versions of chat interfaces combined onto their search engines, or, operating independently. So I think it's a really interesting space right now. I think we still think that we have a lot of unique value to add, and we do it in maybe a different way, which I think will be useful. But I would just say, if you're interested in search, this is definitely a fascinating area to pay attention to. And if you're interested in you.com, you can definitely reach out. So my email is, Saahil@you.com. So SAAHIL@you.com. Definitely reach out if you ever want to talk about search topics. Always happy to discuss, or anything else. And then lastly, if you're interested, you can also reach out to us. We are hiring for, various areas.
There we go.
And design, etc.
Nice.
So definitely reach out.
Dude, it sounds like an awesome place to work.
Yeah, an exciting time to work in this space. I mean, you're competing with the giants. You're also gaining all this momentum, doing something that is super relevant and a hot topic in lots of different areas outside of search as well. But I also agree, like, search is something awesome is happening in this space. And it feels like in search, for a while, it was only Google. They were the main competitor, but now that's not the case anymore. So it's going to be very exciting to see what the future holds for search.
Yeah.
Right on, man. Well, I think this is a good place to end it. Thank you so much, Saahil.